High above the war-torn skies of Europe in 1944, a 7-ton steel behemoth was plummeting toward the Earth at high speed. Inside the cockpit, the invisible hand of the Grim Reaper was already tightly gripping the pilot's throat. The stick was frozen. It felt as though it had been set in hardened concrete. No matter how hard he pulled, the fighter plane resisted his human will. The aircraft stubbornly bit into its vertical trajectory. Outside the canopy, the cloud layers were violently torn apart in seconds. The ground, a sprawling web of certain death, was expanding rapidly before his eyes. It seemed there was only one possible outcome. Being smashed into a million pieces was inevitable. However, in the final second, where extreme panic and absolute despair collided, he violently thrust his hand out and yanked the wrong lever. This desperate and theoretically fatal pile of terror did not kill him. Instead, as if by some dark magic, it violently snatched him back from the very gates of hell. The aircraft did not disintegrate. Even more incredibly, this amateur mistake was written into the official training manuals of the United States military months later. For more than half a century since, it has been taught as a mandatory life-saving maneuver for every modern jet fighter pilot now. What kind of miracle allowed a rookie's potentially fatal blunder to become an immortal doctrine in the history of aviation? Today, we are rewinding the clock back to that era of fire and steel to bear witness to a revolutionary discovery. The time is the spring of 1944, and the skies over the European theater are hosting a brutal meat grinder. Every single day, hundreds of American fighter planes are tasked with escorting massive bomber formations deep into the Third Reich. And every single day, waves of German Luftwaffe interceptors rise to meet them, painting the skies with fire and smoke. In this merciless war of attrition, the tally of victories and losses are ultimately reduced to cold and unforgiving numbers. Taking center stage in this theater was one of the primary workhorses of the Army, Air Forces, the legendary P-47. This was a true monster of the skies. Fully loaded, it weighed a staggering 7 tons and had 850 caliber machine guns. It was built around a monstrous, turbocharged engine capable of unleashing 2,000 horsepower during heavy flight. It possessed incredibly thick armor, allowing it to absorb punishing enemy fire that would shred a Mustang into confetti. The pilots who flew it spoke of it with reverent awe, affectionately dubbing it the Jug or the flying tank in battle. However, this seemingly indestructible juggernaut harbored a dark and fatal Achilles heel that could kill any pilot. When this heavy fighter was pushed into a high-speed, steep dive, it ceased to be a reliable companion for its pilot. Instead, it transformed into a runaway coffin made of iron and aluminum, hurtling toward the Earth with no escape. When the P-47's velocity exceeded 450 miles per hour, a terrifying physical phenomenon would seize control. This phenomenon was known as compressibility, where the air flowing over the wings and tail became intensely compressed. At these speeds, violent shockwaves effectively stripped the tail elevators of all lift and aerodynamic authority instantly. Once an aircraft crossed this invisible threshold, the control stick would instantly lock up as if bolted to the floor. The rudder pedals felt like they were bolted down, the ailerons froze, and the heavy nose plunged downward with fury. Many desperate pilots physically broke the bones in their own arms against the immense, unyielding aerodynamic pressure. Other pilots, overcome by terror, chose to bail out rather than ride a falling meteor into the European soil. Faced with these laws, the official doctrine from the Army Air Forces was blunt and absolute regarding steep dives. Under no circumstances are you to pursue a diving enemy aircraft at a steep angle or cross the speed mark. If you see a German plane roll over and dive away, let him go. You break off the pursuit or you die. It did not take long for the seasoned ace pilots of the German Luftwaffe to discover this glaring American weakness. They weaponized it into a highly efficient escape tactic. Whenever in a tight spot, they would dive vertically at speed. The American pursuers were instantly forced into a lethal dilemma: abandon the kill or follow the German and crash. Day after day, American pilots ignored the golden rule and followed their prey into the compressibility death spiral. The man destined to break this deadly curse was not a battle-hardened ace. It was a 19-year-old named Robert Booth. Second Lieutenant Booth had recently been assigned to the 56th Fighter Group, stationed at Boxted in England. The 56th was one of the oldest, most elite, and highly decorated outfits in the entire theater of the war. To showcase their aggressive spirit, the pilots painted fierce wolf heads on the cowlings of their Thunderbolts. They proudly called themselves Zink's Wolfcap. Compared to these veterans, Booth was nothing more than a lost lamb. He was not a natural-born aviation prodigy. He wasn't the type of hotshot cadet who soloed in 8 hours. His flight instructors stateside had evaluated him with mild terms: methodical, very careful, slightly slow to react. Booth didn't drink heavily at the officers' club. He never boasted, and he wrote 2 letters a week to his mother. He had grown up on a sprawling farm just outside Allentown, spending his adolescence repairing tractors and harvesters. This background gave him an intuitive understanding of machinery. When faced with a failure, you must solve it logically. It was exactly this deep-seated composure that drove him to volunteer for the Army Air Forces in 1942. After enduring a grueling flight training program, he finally arrived in England in March 1944. In this arena of aerial slaughter, he was the greenest rookie, logging 67 hours of flight time in the P-47. The veterans treated him with restraint. Few were willing to trust a new guy who might not survive 5 missions. The gears of fate began to turn on the morning of April 18, 1944. The briefing called for a run. It called for a deep escort run for heavy bombers heading to Brandenburg. The European sky was a treacherous, murky soup. Thick, gray cloud layers stacked tightly up to 20,000 feet. Visibility was abysmal, barely 2 miles. As the pilot with the least seniority, Booth was assigned to the rearmest position, the dreaded tail end Charlie spot. Before takeoff, he meticulously ran through his instrument check every 30 seconds: oil pressure, fuel mixtures. The cockpit was suffocating, filled with the smells of hot oil, burning rubber, and nervous sweat, the perfume of war. As they climbed through 20,000 feet, the terrifying black bursts of anti-aircraft flak bloomed around them. Shortly after, the radio crackled with a combat warning. German WW2 fighters punched through the clouds. They plummeted toward the bomber's stream. The dogfight erupted in a fraction of a second in the European sky. The German fighters slashed into the American formation like hungry wolves, and Booth's elements scattered to intercept. In the chaotic swirl of the furball, a German fighter suddenly executed a violent left turn and dropped its nose. It sliced directly into a dense cloud bank. In that instant, crushing G-forces pinned Booth violently against his seat. His peripheral vision began to tunnel and gray out. He instinctively tightened his abdominal muscles to force blood up. Perhaps it was rookie courage, or perhaps combat adrenaline overpowered his training, but Booth forgot the card in a rule. He shoved his stick forward, shoved the throttle to the firewall, and chased the WW2 into the murky clouds. When he finally punched out of the bottom of the cloud layer, the sight before him snapped him back to cold reality. The German was racing eastward at terrifying speed, hugging the deck 50 feet above the ground in a river valley. Desperate to close the distance, Booth kept his throttle wide open. The massive Thunderbolt accelerated like a train. Fueled by gravity and a roaring to 1,000 horsepower engine, the needle on his airspeed indicator began a sweep. The needle began a frantic sweep, 300 miles per hour, 350, 400 miles per hour. Up ahead, his element leader opened fire, sending a deadly arc of glowing tracer rounds toward the German fighter. This forced the WW2 to snap into a hard left turn and vanish behind a dense tree line in the valley. Seeing the target break away, the flight leader wisely pulled his nose up and began to climb back to high altitude. But Booth did not follow his leader. His eyes were totally fixated on the point where the German had disappeared. He rolled into a steep left bank and pushed his nose even lower. He was less than 200 feet off the ground. The gray ribbon of the river flashed by below him in a terrifying blur. He was flying at incredible speed. It was exactly at the moment Booth attempted to pull back on the stick and climb out that the demon awakened. He realized too late that his pass had missed entirely, his bullets passing harmlessly behind the enemy plane. But far worse, at the top of a looping maneuver, the German pilot had inverted his aircraft and entered a vertical dive. Before Booth's brain could rationally process the danger, his hands instinctively pushed the stick forward to follow him. The airspeed needle surged past the red line, 400 miles per hour, 420, 450. As the massive aircraft smashed through this fatal aerodynamic threshold, all feedback from the flight controls vanished. Booth hauled back on the control stick with all his might, but the sensitive metal column felt welded to the floorboards. He pulled, he jerked, he braced his boots against the rudder pedals and hauled with his entire upper body. Nothing happened. The heavy nose continued its relentless plunge toward the earth, the dive angle growing steeper by the exact second. The altimeter was unwinding with terrifying speed, 15,000 feet, 12,000 feet, 10,000 feet. The entire airframe began to vibrate violently. The metal wings shrieked, emitting a horrific, agonizing groan. It sounded like an invisible giant was trying to tear the aircraft limb from limb. Death was staring him right in the face. Booth's mind went entirely blank. He frantically tried to roll the elevator trim tabs to manually force the nose up. This was a standard emergency procedure when primary controls fail, but it was utterly useless under these extreme conditions. The supersonic shockwaves ripping over the tail section at 450 miles per hour rendered the trim completely dead. The earth was rushing up to smash him at hundreds of feet per second. He was so low he could clearly make out the textures. He could see the leaves on the trees and the slate tiles on a church spire. Bailing out was far too late for that. Attempting to open the canopy and jump into a slipstream at this altitude was just a more complicated way of committing suicide. In this moment of ultimate, blinding despair, in the span of a half-second that would later be scrutinized by generations, 19-year-old Booth made a desperate, almost insane decision. He needed drag, any physical force to slow down. He needed anything, any physical force that could slow this runaway meteor down. He was totally consumed by sheer panic. His trembling left hand reached out, intending to grab the landing gear handle to drop the wheels into the wind. His frantic logic was to drop the heavy landing gear into the slipstream to create massive air resistance and slow down. It was a wildly dangerous, half-baked idea. Deploying the landing gear at 450 miles per hour would be fatal. It would almost certainly cause the immense wind pressure to rip the gear doors clean off the wings in a single second. This would likely tear the heavy metal struts right out of the wings and cause a catastrophic structural failure of the plane. But as the cockpit shook violently, his hand missed its intended target. By some incredible stroke of divine intervention, his fingers wrapped around the handle sitting right next to it, the wing flaps, and he pulled it backward with massive force. To any trained aviator, deploying wing flaps during a high speed, vertical dive is considered textbook aviation suicide. Flaps are delicate aerodynamic surfaces designed specifically to be extended at very low speeds during landing approaches. Deploying them into a 450 mile per hour supersonic shockwave should theoretically destroy the aircraft entirely. It should destroy the aerodynamic integrity instantly, snapping the metal wings clean off the fuselage in a fraction of time. But an absolute miracle, a physical impossibility that defied every manual, was born from this colossal amateur error. The very microsecond the flaps dropped down into the slipstream, a gargantuan wall of drag slammed into the fighter plane. The deceleration was instant, violent. and catastrophic to the senses. Booth felt a colossal force hurl him straight forward. He was hurled violently against his shoulder harness. His head snapped forward, smashing heavily into the glass gun sight. The thick canvas belts bit into his collarbone so hard he thought they would snap. But the aircraft's velocity plummeted. In a fraction of a second, the compressibility shockwaves over the tail dissipated. The elevators regained their grip on air. Accompanied by the terrifying shriek of twisting metal, the nose of the P-47 pitched upward with absolute violence. The sudden onset of positive G-forces hit Booth like a tidal wave, far exceeding the physiological limits of the human body. His vision instantly blacked out, the blood brutally drained from his brain, and he slumped unconscious in the seat harness. He had absolutely no idea how much time passed. It could have been 3 seconds, but it felt like an entire century to him. When the oxygen-starved brain of the pilot finally rebounded, he had absolutely no concept of where he was or what happened. He instinctively stiffened his posture, blinking through the gray haze, and realized he was passing 3,000 feet. His airspeed indicator read a sluggish 210 miles per hour. He wasn't dead. The plane hadn't shattered to bits. Instead, the Thunderbolt was flying completely inverted in a steady and controlled climb toward the upper cloud deck. The flight controls were responding beautifully to his inputs. He looked around, no German fighters, no river valley. There was just the quiet, empty expanse of the clouds. He glanced down at his instrument panel to check the gauges. He noticed the warning light for the landing gear was off. It was only then, looking at the position of the levers, he realized with absolute horror what he had done. He hadn't pulled the landing gear. He had dumped the wing flaps. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely keep his grip on the stick. His mind was incapable of processing. He could not process the physics of his survival. All he knew, with absolute certainty, was one fact: he was alive. For the next 15 minutes, he gingerly rolled the bruised aircraft back level and crept into the safety of the clouds. Like a guilty child trying to sneak back into the house, he quietly reattached himself to the rear of his formation. Booth tried to mentally reconstruct the terrifying sequence. That night, sitting on his narrow cot in the barracks, he dumped the flaps. The plane violently decelerated. The nose snapped up, and he survived. It violated every single rule. It violated every rule written in every aviation manual ever printed. Deploying flaps was never a standard recovery technique. It wasn't written in a single textbook, and it sure as hell wasn't taught in flight school back in the United States. Booth knew he had committed a monumentally stupid rookie mistake, and a deep wave of shame washed over him in the barracks. He was terrified that if he breathed a word of this to the combat-hardened veterans of the Wolf Cap, he would be laughed at. He feared he would be laughed out of the ready room, or worse, grounded permanently for reckless flying during a mission. For the next few days, he kept his mouth firmly shut, harboring the secret that had saved his life during that fatal dive. The day after the incident, during a mission debriefing, he hesitantly brought up the dive to his veteran flight leader. The leader was a grizzled captain from Texas, wearing the Distinguished Flying Cross and boasting a dozen confirmed kills. The veteran just scoffed, told him that fear makes men do crazy things, and ordered him to forget it and focus on flying. Booth tried to bury the memory, but the cold, hard physical reality kept echoing in his mind. The flaps created massive drag. The drag broke the speed. Breaking the speed restored the flight controls. It was a logical chain of physical events. It was an answer to a puzzle that had killed dozens of his friends. The internal struggle gnawed at him for 2 full days. Finally, unable to hold it in, he sought out the squadron engineering officer. This lieutenant was a seasoned mechanic. He had flown 10 combat missions himself before being grounded for medical reasons. He knew the anatomy of the aircraft. He knew the machine better than he knew his own face. When Booth nervously explained his actions, the officer didn't laugh. Instead, his eyes widened as he instantly grasped the monumental tactical value of this accidental engine nearing discovery. However, he also bluntly laid out the risks, dropping the flaps into a 450-mile-per-hour slipstream. It was practically begging the aerodynamic forces to tear the flap doors right off their hinges, destroying the wing. If a pilot dumped the flaps and the plane failed to recover from the dive, he would be wrestling a damaged aircraft. He would be a sitting duck right in the middle of hostile airspace for any German interceptor with a working trigger. Booth understood the grim arithmetic, but he stubbornly insisted that the discovery was simply too important to bury. The engineering officer immediately kicked the report up the chain of command. 3 days later, the unthinkable happened. The legendary group commander, Colonel Hubert Zemk, personally summoned Booth to his office to discuss the incident. Zemk was only 30 years old, but he was already an aviation god, a ruthless tactician with 20 confirmed kills. He was the very soul of the 56th Fighter Group. Zemk despised stupidity and had zero tolerance for carelessness. But he was also a brilliant leader who listened, especially 2 pilots who had stared death in the face and lived to talk. With an intimidating glare, Zemk ordered Booth to recount exactly what happened. Booth didn't embellish or exaggerate. He spoke in slow, precise terms, detailing the entry speed, the locked controls, and the accidental pull of the lever. He also detailed the violent recovery. Zemk interrogated him on the exact indicated airspeed when the flaps deployed. Zemk also estimated altitude lost before the nose came up. Booth answered all questions very steadily. Airspeed was between 450 and 460 miles per hour. Altitude lost was barely 500 feet. Then Zemk cast the million-dollar question. When the ground crews inspected his aircraft after the flight, was it damaged? Did the landing gears cycle normally? Booth replied, "Sir, they were completely perfectly normal without any damage at all." Colonel Zemk leaned back in his leather chair and fell into a deep, intimidating silence. He knew exactly what was at stake. As a master tactician, he knew what was at stake if he could test this maneuver under controlled conditions at high altitude. If it actually worked, it would instantly neutralize the Luftwaffe's greatest defensive advantage during aerial combat. If it failed, well, it would just mean burying a crazy idea along with the test pilot. Zemk dismissed Booth from his office. The test flight was officially scheduled for the morning of April 25th. It was a crisp, clear morning on the runway. The sun washed over the Bachstedt runway. Colonel Zemk, refusing to risk his men's limbs on an unproven theory, stepped up. He personally strapped into a P-47. He ordered a chase plane equipped with a gun camera to follow him up into the sky. The chase plane was to follow him up to 20,000 feet to document the test. Without a shred of hesitation, Zemk moved. Zemk pushed the heavy nose of the jug over and entered the dreaded compressibility dive. 30 degrees, 40 degrees, 50 degrees. The airspeed indicator spun like a top. 300, 350, 400 miles per hour. As the needle kissed 450, the controls turned to concrete exactly as expected. Zemk hauled back on the stick. Nothing happened. In a terrifying 70-degree plunge, the altimeter unwound in a blur. The massive engine howled loudly. The airframe began its violent, characteristic death shudder. Right at the very edge of the abyss, Zemk reached down firmly. He firmly yanked the flap lever. The miracle repeated itself. With a violently explosive deceleration, brutal forces hit him. Brutal G-forces slammed the ace pilot deep into his seat, draining the color from his vision completely in a fraction of time. But just as the altimeter crossed 14,000 feet, the nose of the Thunderbolt snapped upward with incredible authority. The dive angle flattened out from 40 degrees to 30 to 20. In less than 10 agonizing seconds, the plane recovered. The aircraft had completely pulled out of the fatal plunge and was climbing toward the heavens. Zemk cleanly retracted flaps. He opened the throttle and climbed right back to 20,000 feet. Then, incredibly, He pointed the nose down once again. He did it again, this time pushing the speed to 460 miles per hour, then a third touching higher speeds. He touched a blistering 470 miles per hour, every single time amidst the terrifying roar of wind and gravity. The steel behemoth violently ripped itself from the jaws of compressibility and lived. The chase plane captured all recoveries. The gun camera captured all 3 miraculous recoveries on film. That very afternoon, Colonel Zemk summoned his commanders. He summoned every squadron commander in the group to a mandatory briefing. With calm, absolute authority, he made an announcement. He announced that, as of that moment, the emergency flapbrick of re-technique for high-speed dives was officially authorized. He mandated that every single pilot in the Wolfcap must take their aircraft to high altitude and practice the violent maneuver. They must practice it before flying another combat mission. Within 2 weeks, every P-47 pilot had mastered the trick. Within a month, the knowledge had leapt to the legendary 4th Fighter Group. By June, it was being drilled into recruits. It was being drilled into the heads of fresh recruits at the replacement training units across England during the summer. And by August of 1944, this unbelievable maneuver was officially printed in the emergency operating manuals. The technique born purely from the blind, panic, and clumsy mistake of a terrified 19-year-old became official doctrine. The handle pulled in error by a rookie lieutenant fundamentally rewrote the rules of aerial warfare in Europe forever. The tactical results were immediate and staggering. Between May and September of 1944, combat loss rates dropped. Across all 8th Air Force units flying the P-47, the combat loss rate attributed to fatal dives plummeted. Dropped by an astonishing 18%, fighter pilots reported a massive surge in aggression and confidence. They no longer feared the vertical chase. The German Luftwaffe's go-to-survival tactic was completely shattered now. When German pilots rolled over and dove for the deck, expecting the Americans to pull away in fear, they looked back. They looked in their rear-view mirrors and were horrified to see the heavy Thunderbolts plunging right down after them. The American planes would magically pull out at the last possible second and fill their cockpits with armor-piercing rounds. Second Lieutenant Robert Booth, the young man whose mistake altered the course of aviation history, quietly survived. He miraculously survived the bloodbath of the European Air War. He flew a total of 60 grueling combat missions. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and an Air Medal for oak leaf clusters for his wartime service. He eventually mustered out of the military as a first lieutenant. In July 1945, he returned to his home. He returned to the quiet farmland of Pennsylvania, just as unassuming as the day he had left for the brutal war in Europe. He almost never spoke about the war. He married his high school sweetheart and raised 3 children in a peaceful life. He took a job as a quiet, dedicated mechanic at a local John Deere tractor dealership, repairing agricultural machinery. He spent the next few decades repairing agricultural machinery. He never put his hands on flight controls ever again. His quiet life remained completely undisturbed until 1973, when an official letter arrived in his mailbox. The letter carried the official seal of the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. Researchers compiling a history stumbled. Researchers compiling a comprehensive history of P-47 combat tactics had stumbled upon fragmented records. They found fragmented records regarding the flapbrick of re-technique. Following the paper trail, they unearthed Booth's name. His name was buried in a dusty mission report from April 1944. They wrote to ask him for an interview. Booth drove to Dayton, Ohio, sat in a cramped, windowless office across from a historian and a spinning tape recorder. In the exact same slow, precise, entirely unboastful tone he had used with Hubs 30 years prior, he recounted. He recounted the fraction of a second that changed history. The historian leaned forward and asked an important question. He asked if he felt proud to have invented a technique that saved so many lives. The old veteran fell silent for a moment. The old veteran, who had walked the razor's edge of mortality, fell silent for a long moment. Then, he looked down. Looking down at his rough, mechanic's hands, he softly replied, "I'm just really glad it helped. That is all, it helped." That audio recording was permanently archived in the museum's vaults. The maneuver, born from terror and terror, remained. It was relentlessly studied by test pilots and aerospace engineers for decades, becoming a foundational case study. It became a foundational case study in emergency flight control recovery, from the dawn of the jet age in the 50s, all the way to the supersonic fighters of the 21st century. The core principle of using induced drag remains. The principle to break the sound barrier and regain aerodynamic authority remains enshrined in training manuals worldwide. In the vast, cold, and merciless machinery of global warfare, thousands of stories of life and death play out every day. Sometimes, the fragile boundary between living to see tomorrow and becoming a crater in the ground comes down to an error. It comes down to pulling the wrong piece of metal in a dark cockpit. The story of Robert Booth proves true heroism. True heroism isn't just found in glorious kill tallies, chest FULs of medals, or flawless tactical execution in combat. It is equally present in the raw, desperate, biological instinct to survive and in the quiet courage to confess a mistake. A humble farm boy, in a split-second completely dominated by absolute terror, accidentally cracked an aerodynamic code. He didn't win the war single-handedly, but he reached out and saved the lives of countless young men from falling steel. In a sky ruled by cold data, human fragility, sheer panic, and an imperfect terror became a beacon of survival forever. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history's deadliest aviation miscalculations, smash that like button and subscribe. I am your dedicated strategy observer in the sky. I will see you on the next high-altitude battlefield of history soon.